Hey everyone. So if you're completing this training, that means that you have English learners and or exited monitored students in one of the core content areas. Progress monitoring is extremely important for our current and former English learners so that we can ensure that they're making adequate progress, both academically and in the case of our current ELs, also in language development. We need your help as their teachers to provide the data and recommendations for instructional and testing supports so that they are getting the accommodations that will best meet their needs. Monitoring forms are assigned quarterly and are reviewed by your campus's LPAC, or Language Proficiency Assessment Committee, so that changes in program assignments and instructional or testing accommodations can be made. When you log into Ellevation, you'll see a red dot at the top of the page above monitoring if any monitoring forms have been assigned to you. You can click here and open your monitoring page. So I can see here that I have one progress monitoring and one exited student monitoring form assigned to me, and they're both due on October 30th. Let's go through the progress monitoring form first. So for this fourth grade student, I'm going to go through the form, and the first box is asking me to enter instructional accommodations. Now, if I want a reminder of the instructional accommodations that are assigned to this student, I can click on the student profile, which will open in a new window, and go to the instructional accommodations tab. Now, the selected instructional accommodations are all based on the student's current proficiency levels in listening, speaking, reading, and writing, based on the most recent proficiency assessments. So you only want to list the accommodations that you're currently using with the student based on need. For example, I can see that this student is at an advanced level of listening, and it's suggested that he might benefit from visuals, verbal cues, and gestures to support understanding, or increasing wait time for students to progress information, just as an example. But I don't want to list these accommodations on my progress monitoring page if the student typically doesn't need these supports for listening activities. Also, for speaking, for example, provide simple sentence frames, answer choices, or graphic organizers. You might be providing these supports for all students some of the time to support lesson delivery, but the question is whether or not the student truly needs the support in order to comprehend the content. So the trick here is not to just copy and paste every accommodation that's checked, but to list only those supports that you are currently using with the student in order for them to be more successful. You can also review the descriptors here. If the descriptors for the student at the current level describe how the student is performing most consistently, then the supports selected are probably still appropriate. But if the student needs more support or maybe has advanced to the next level most consistently, then we may need to modify the instructional supports, which we'll review below. But if I go back to my instructional accommodations, I can simply cut or copy and paste the accommodations into this box. And I can do that for as many of those as are appropriate. Again, making sure that these are the ones that the student actually needs in order to perform successfully in class. Once you're done with that, you can go down to testing supports. Now, this is not an extensive, complete list of all testing supports. For example, if the student has an IEP or 504 plan, he or she may receive other testing accommodations that are approved by one or more of those committees. These are testing supports that are specific to language development and should only be selected if the supports are routinely and effectively used to support the student's regular testing, including CFAs and benchmarks. Again, for example, if the student receives extra time because of a 504 accommodation, we don't want to check that here. We only want to check those that are given to a student because of their language needs. Now we get to the overall recommendation for the student, and this will drive whether or not the LPAC makes any revisions to the student's instructional accommodations. If you feel that for your content area or areas, the instructional accommodations selected for the student are still appropriate, then we want to check that first selection. But let's say that the student is having difficulty with listening activities, even with the support selected for him. Maybe the visuals and gestures and sufficient wait time still aren't enough for the student to understand regular classroom instruction and conversation. If this is true for any of the language domains, then I want to click on Modify Instructional Supports. However, if none of those supports are needed, in other words, if the student doesn't need any visuals or wait time for listening, I can click to remove instructional supports because the student has progressed. And again, you would select this if it is true for one or more domains. Now in the next box, I'm going to write a quick comment, just a quick note to justify my selection. I can type something like, if I'm recommending to remove supports, student no longer needs visuals, wait time, or other supports for listening activities. And then that will justify my reasoning that those instructional supports can be removed. However, if I selected to modify the instructional supports because the current ones selected are not enough, then I would put a note to justify that reasoning. For example, student requires additional support beyond intermediate supports for speaking, or whatever the language domain is. And you can do that for as many of the language domains as are appropriate for the student. Then I can either draw or choose an electronic signature and submit the form. And then once you're done, or you can move on to the next progress monitoring form that you have. So if you have exited monitored students, the form is a little bit different. So I'm going to go back to my monitoring homepage, and I'm going to click on the exited monitoring form that's been assigned to me. Now, the goal for our exited students is to monitor their academic progress to ensure that they were not exited from a bilingual or ESL program too early, impeding their language development. For this student, I'm going to click first on the grades for only my subject area that were submitted for the previous 9 weeks grading period. So for example, if I'm a math teacher, I'm just going to click on the grade range in which the student performed. So let me go back up to math. And if the student got a 75 in algebra, then I'm going to click on that grade range. If the grade is below a 60, then I need to elaborate and give some reasoning here. For example, if the student got poor grades because of not turning in assignments or because of excessive absences, the committee will need to know this information when determining if a student needs to re-enter a language program. Next is for testing, CFAs, and benchmarks. If no CFAs or benchmarks were applicable for the previous grading period, then you would just click not applicable for your subject area. And again, you're only doing this for the subject area that you teach. Again, if there were any CFAs or benchmark scores and any of them were below a 60, then you would need to elaborate and give reasoning in your opinion why the grades fall below a 60 in the box below. Then indicate the student's classroom behavior, as well as whether or not the student consistently performs on grade level in listening, speaking, reading, and writing. In other words, we want to ascertain that the student is comparable to his or her native English-speaking peers for all types of language activities. Then there's a box to indicate if the student has had excessive absences. And then finally, your selections, and this is the most important part. If the student is on grade level, even if the student has had some failing grades, if it is not due to language, then we want to continue monitoring the student. Remember that we monitor exited students for a period of 2 years. So if we don't think that the student is struggling, or if the student is struggling but not because of language issues, we don't want to make any changes to the student status. We want to continue monitoring the student to make sure that he or she doesn't need any language supports. If, however, we feel that the student needs language supports to perform on grade level, maybe they have to use a bilingual dictionary a lot, or their writing shows native language interference, or they have trouble understanding content in class without a lot of supports, that is when we will mark the second selection, so that the committee can review and evaluate whether or not the student should be re-entered into the bilingual or ESL program and receive language services. Again, it is really important not to check this selection unless you truly believe that the student's difficulties are language-based. One example I like to use is that when I was in high school, I struggled with my chemistry class. Now, as a native English speaker, this isn't because of a language issue for me. I just had a particularly difficult time with chemistry. So we want to make sure that we're making the distinction for the student that is based on their level of English comprehension and not simply a difficulty in the content area that could apply to any student. And again, at the bottom, you will choose or draw your e-signature and then submit. Once you've submitted all of your forms, then the red dot will go away at the top and you will be done for the monitoring forms due for the quarter. If you have any questions about how to fill out monitoring forms or have any difficulties in Ellevation, reach out to your campus special program specialist or LPAC facilitator counselor. Thanks for listening.